In the dead of night, beneath a canopy of stars the world had forgotten, a steel leviathan drifted silently through the Arctic darkness. The water above was frozen solid, an endless, crushing ceiling of ancient ice. Below, blackness deeper than any ocean trench. In between, a single fragile vessel clung to the thin line between history and death. It was 1931. The world was roaring through the age of jazz and flappers, yet this place, this frozen graveyard at the top of the earth, knew nothing of it. Here, time held its breath. And buried deep in this silence, a dream stirred. Inside the narrow hull of the Nautilus, rivets strained under pressure. Men whispered prayers beneath their breath. Ice scraped across steel like fingernails on bone. This was no ordinary journey. It wasn't merely about geography, it was about defiance. A rebellion against nature's oldest law, that the polar cap is unconquerable. But one man believed otherwise. Sir George Hubert Wilkins, polar explorer, war photographer, aviator, madman to some, visionary to others. While the world looked to the skies, he looked beneath the ice. Where others saw certain death, he saw possibility. He had faced bullets in the trenches of World War I. He had flown across the desolate Antarctic where no soul had dared. But nothing compared to this. This was his obsession. To plunge a submarine beneath the polar ice sheet. To dive where no man had even dreamed. To explore the last true void on Earth. They called it foolish. They called it suicidal. But Wilkins called it destiny. Yet beneath that ice, something waited. Not a monster, not a ghost, but the cold indifference of nature and the terrible price of ambition. Before Wilkins ever set eyes on the Arctic through the periscope of a submarine, hundreds had already tried, and failed, to conquer the roof of the world. The North Pole, that invisible dot atop our spinning planet, had called out to the bold and the desperate for centuries. To many, it was more than just a navigational marker. It was a symbol, a riddle, a challenge hurled by nature itself. As early as the 1500s, sailors believed the pole might hold a mythical sea warmed by the sun's constant gaze. Maps were drawn showing open water, even palm trees, at the top of the world. These fantasies lured adventurers into the ice, where they froze, starved, and vanished. In the 19th century, the polar obsession intensified. Nations poured resources into Arctic expeditions, not for profit, not even for science, but for glory. Sir John Franklin in 1845 led 2 ships into the Canadian Arctic in search of a northwest passage. They were never seen again. Their wooden vessels, the Erebus and Terror, became tombs beneath the ice. Rescuers sent after them suffered the same fate. Over 130 men were lost. Inuit whispers told of starving white men driven to cannibalism, faces blackened with frostbite. But still they came. Some tried dogsleds, braving months of whiteout conditions. Others traveled on foot, dragging sledges across jagged sea ice that shifted and cracked under their weight. Many froze before even reaching the halfway point. And even when they did, the pole was a phantom. Drifting sea ice made calculations unreliable. Many explorers died without ever knowing how close, or how far, they truly were. Then came the age of airships and planes. In 1926, the Italian-designed Norge, a hydrogen-filled dirigible, became the first verified craft to fly over the pole, piloted by Roald Amundsen, the man who had already claimed the South Pole. But it had only flown over the Arctic. No one had yet touched it, and certainly no one had passed under it. The idea of using a submarine to reach the North Pole was, to many, lunacy. Submarines were still primitive machines, hot, noisy, unreliable. During World War I, they were mostly crude metal tubes, barely able to stay afloat, let alone navigate under thousands of miles of ice. But one man saw them differently. Sir Hubert Wilkins. Born in Australia in 1888, Wilkins grew up on a sheep station that saw more droughts than rainfall. The harsh landscape taught him 2 things: survival, and how to thrive where others gave up. He learned early that nature was cruel, but that its rules could be bent, even broken. He ran away to pursue photography, covering conflicts from Gallipoli to the Balkans. In World War I, he was decorated for bravery. Afterward, he turned his lens to the poles. In 1928, he piloted a plane across the Antarctic Peninsula, capturing images of glaciers never before seen by human eyes. It was a death-defying stunt. But to Wilkins, danger was a language he understood. So when Wilkins announced in 1930 that he would lead the first submarine expedition to the North Pole, people laughed. Even other explorers called it madness. But Wilkins didn't flinch. He wasn't just chasing records. He believed the Arctic held secrets that only a submarine could uncover. Ocean currents, underwater mountains, warm layers beneath the ice, all waiting to be discovered. And above all else, he wanted to go where no man had gone before. But dreams like that don't come cheap. He needed a vessel. He needed backers. And he needed a way to turn the impossible into headlines. The Arctic would demand a machine as bold as the man commanding it. For Sir Hubert Wilkins, that machine was the Nautilus. But this wasn't some futuristic marvel of engineering. It was a war relic, a discarded hulk from the past. Originally commissioned during World War I, the submarine had served the U.S. Navy as O-12, an attack sub designed for combat, not exploration. It had been sitting in naval reserve, rusting slowly into obsolescence. To most, the vessel was nothing more than scrap metal. But Wilkins saw potential. He secured the rights to lease the sub from the U.S. Navy, subchartering it for his expedition. But the real transformation would come from a man who, in his own right, was a dreamer, Simon Lake, an eccentric naval architect and one of the founding fathers of submarine design. Lake had spent decades tinkering with underwater vessels. He believed submarines could be more than weapons. They could be tools of peace and discovery, a way to explore the vast, unknown world beneath the waves. So when Wilkins approached him, asking if this tired, creaking war sub could be modified to travel thousands of kilometers under Arctic ice, Lake didn't laugh. He rolled up his sleeves. The Nautilus was stripped down and heavily modified. What emerged was a Frankenstein's monster of ambition and desperation. Part military machine, part scientific laboratory. Lake reinforced the bow with heavy steel plating and poured concrete, making it capable of smashing through underwater ice formations without crumpling like a tin can. A hydraulic shock absorber was added to soften these bone-rattling impacts. But what if the Nautilus needed to surface through solid ice? Lake devised a solution that bordered on science fiction. He installed sledge runners on the top of the sub, like those of a giant Arctic sled. In theory, these would allow the Nautilus to glide along the underside of the ice, scraping softly rather than colliding head-on. To maintain safe distances from the frozen ceiling above, a retractable guide arm was mounted, acting like an underwater antenna that could detect overhanging dangers. Most daring of all, Lake invented custom drills, powerful enough to bore through up to 20 feet of solid ice. These would allow the crew to access air and sunlight, or even create emergency escape hatches in case of disaster. At least, that was the theory. In place of the torpedo tubes, Lake built a pressurized diving chamber. From here, instruments could be lowered to the ocean floor, or brave crew members could conduct dives beneath the polar ice, an idea that had never been attempted. More than 24 custom systems were added. Heating coils, sonar-like listening devices, reinforced battery chambers, and experimental air filtration units were all crammed into the already claustrophobic interior. The vessel was now part submarine, part icebreaker, part underwater laboratory. But there was a problem. Wilkins didn't trust the modifications. He believed many of the innovations were more dangerous than useful. The sledge runners, he feared, could lodge the sub into ice, leaving them stuck beneath the frozen ceiling. The ice drills might break or jam. The shock absorber could crumple or misfire. He requested the installation of a photosensitive electrical cell, which would measure the thickness of the ice above the sub in real time, vital for knowing where they could safely surface. But Simon Lake refused. It was his submarine. He had leased it to Wilkins, not sold it. The final say remained with him. Wilkins could either accept the sub as it was, or walk away. And he accepted it. But even before leaving port, the dream sub became a nightmare. During test runs, the ice drills failed repeatedly. Electrical systems glitched. The hydraulic shock absorber leaked under pressure. Mechanical failures sent the sub back into dry dock again and again. Wilkins watched precious weeks slip through his fingers. The clock was ticking, not just on the short Arctic summer, but on his contract with William Randolph Hearst. Hearst, the legendary newspaper mogul, had agreed to finance the expedition, but only if it could dazzle the public. He gave Wilkins exclusive sponsorship, promising to pay out a $150,000 bonus if the expedition made headlines, especially if it met the Graf Zeppelin, an enormous German airship, at the pole. Wilkins would rise from the ice just as the airship flew overhead. The world would witness a dramatic conquest from above and below. That was the pitch. That was the deal. But with the Nautilus still breaking down in harbor, Wilkins was running out of time. If he couldn't reach the pole on schedule, he would lose the bonus. Worse, he'd be financially ruined. By June 1931, Wilkins had had enough. The drills didn't work. The engine groaned. The custom gear backfired. But the Arctic wouldn't wait. Nor would Hearst. Nor would history. The Nautilus would sail. July 1931. With fanfare behind and danger ahead, the Nautilus slipped beneath the waves of the Barents Sea. The crew of 20 men, half adventurers, half reluctant Navy loners, entered the abyss of the unknown. Claustrophobia set in quickly. The cold was biting, and the air stank of oil, sweat, and fear. Inside the sub, the atmosphere turned tense. The vessel creaked under pressure. Pipes hissed. The lights flickered. The equipment, untested and experimental, behaved like a ticking bomb. A single malfunction here, under miles of crushing Arctic water, could mean instant death. Then came the ice. They dove deeper, under the frozen ceiling of the world, navigating blind through black water. The crew used sonar-like hydrophones to hear the ice above them, but every groan of shifting pressure made hearts stop. There was no turning back. In these moments, Wilkins, calm on the surface, kept a secret. He wasn't sure the Nautilus could survive this. But history had its eyes on them. Back in America, Hearst's reporters were already crafting the headlines. If they surfaced at the North Pole, Wilkins would be a legend. If not, they'd vanish, entombed forever beneath the polar ice. Under the frozen roof of the world, the Nautilus crawled like a steel insect, lost in darkness. There was no sunlight, no moonlight, only shadows, cold currents, and the ever-present creak of metal resisting a crushing death. The Arctic Ocean above was frozen solid in places, 12 to 20 feet thick, a ceiling of ancient ice that stretched for hundreds of miles. No vessel had ever gone beneath it. The temperature dropped to near freezing inside the sub, despite the heating coils. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like icy sweat. Men wore coats, gloves, and 2 pairs of socks, but still shivered. Their breath hung in the air. The oxygen scrubbers, experimental systems designed to recycle air, began to fail. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Men grew lightheaded. Their heads ached. Some began hallucinating. But there was no turning back. Above them, the ice creaked and snapped. Every sound was amplified in the sub, like thunder trapped inside a tin can. Then the worst happened. The Nautilus struck ice. A sudden, brutal jolt slammed through the hull like a car crash. Men were thrown from bunks and stools. The sub tilted, groaned, then stopped. They had hit an underwater ridge of ice. Captain Sloan Dannenhauer, a rigid and by-the-book naval officer, called for an emergency surface. The sub struggled to rise, but the ice above was too thick. The hydraulic shock absorber failed. The sledge runners offered no help. They were pinned. There was no panic, not yet. Just silence and the realization. They were trapped under ice. Wilkins paced the narrow corridor, hands behind his back, hiding the fear in his eyes. His dream, this glorious, headline-grabbing expedition, was unraveling beneath his feet. The engineers worked around the clock, trying to fix the ballast tanks. They needed to surface immediately. Lake's much-hyped drills were pulled out. The crew powered them up and watched in horror as they sparked, jammed, and failed again. The drills were useless. Pressure was rising in the hull. There was thick. One wrong move, and the sub would become an iron tomb. Some of the younger sailors began whispering among themselves. Stories circulated of cursed expeditions, of ghost ships swallowed by ice, of men frozen in place and found years later with eyes wide open. On the fourth day beneath the ice, the battery compartment flooded. Saltwater met acid. Toxic chlorine gas began to fill the forward compartments. The smell of burning insulation stung their noses. Eyes watered. Men cough-choked. Panic now bloomed like rot. Danenhauer ordered evacuation procedures. But how? They were beneath solid ice. It was Wilkins who made the call. They would vent ballast and force the sub upward, hoping the hull could push through thinner ice. They tried once. Nothing. They tried again. A screeching groan echoed through the Nautilus like the sound of a metal beast in agony. A shudder. A burst of light. The sub's reinforced bow broke through the ice like a whale breaching the surface. They had survived, but the cost had been high. The crew was shaken, some emotionally broken. One man reportedly stood at the top hatch for 2 hours, staring at the polar ice like it was the face of God. Another refused to go below again, certain the sub was cursed. And then came the storm. A ferocious Arctic gale swept across the open water. The exposed Nautilus was tossed like a toy. The steel hull groaned under pressure. Ice floes shifted and slammed against her sides. The men had survived the deep, but now faced the wrath of the frozen sea. For 6 days, the Nautilus drifted, unable to move. Engines frozen. Power low. Communication down. Supplies dwindling. And somewhere to the south, the Graf Zeppelin, the massive German airship, flew over the pole, alone. Wilkins had missed the rendezvous. The historic conquest of the North, from air and sea, was shattered. But Wilkins refused to give up. The world hadn't seen what they had done yet. If he could limp the Nautilus back to civilization, he could still tell the tale. Still claim the first ever under-ice expedition. Still become a legend. All they had to do was make it home. The Nautilus had surfaced, but victory was short-lived. The Arctic held her in place like a frozen coffin. Ice floes slammed into the sub. The cold was unbearable. Food spoiled. Morale plummeted. Tensions boiled. The men no longer trusted Wilkins. Some blamed him for choosing an unfit vessel. Others whispered that he was chasing headlines, not survival. Commander Danenhauer, already bitter about deferring to a civilian, openly clashed with Wilkins over orders. Then, mutiny. The crew demanded they abandon the expedition and return home. Wilkins refused. He wanted to press on, to reach the pole, to salvage history. Danenhauer countered. They'd never survive another push. Lines were drawn. Wilkins, isolated in his cabin, scribbled in his journal by candlelight, haunted, angry, and slipping into obsession. The dream was disintegrating. Meanwhile, Danenhauer seized control. He ordered the sub to limp south, toward Spitsbergen. The expedition was over, declared without ceremony. But Wilkins, he would write the story his way. He would frame it not as failure, but as survival against impossible odds. He would ensure the world remembered him, not as a fool, but as the first man to dare dream beneath the ice. The Nautilus turned away from the pole, defeated, battered, but not broken. The return journey was even harsher. They battled shifting ice, faulty systems, and an atmosphere thick with silence and shame. Wilkins barely spoke. He spent his days cataloging data, as if clinging to science would justify the ordeal. Danenhauer, now acting commander, kept the men focused on survival. The diesel engines stuttered. The heaters failed. Food ran low. Men suffered frostbite and fever. Every inch south was paid for with sweat and discipline. Radio transmissions resumed. The outside world knew they were alive, but the headlines were no longer kind. The ice sub fiasco, some called it. Reporters mocked their failure. Hearst refused to pay the price. Yet beneath the ridicule, there was awe. They had ventured farther under the ice than anyone in history. They had endured a realm no machine was built for. And they had returned. By mid-September, the Nautilus limped into port. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't even closure. But it was survival. And sometimes, in the loneliest corners of the Earth, that's the only victory explorers ever get. When the Nautilus docked, there were no bands, no cheers, just cold stares and unanswered questions. Sir Hubert Wilkins stepped onto land not as a hero, but as a curiosity. Once hailed as one of the greatest polar explorers of the 20th century, he now faced a public more interested in scandal than sacrifice. The press tore him apart. Fool's errand beneath the ice. One headline read. Hearst, sensing no profit in the aftermath, distanced himself. Sponsors vanished. The scientific community remained silent. The Nautilus, the once glorious vessel of ambition, was deemed too damaged for repair. Its hull rusted in a Norwegian dock before being deliberately sunk in a quiet military exercise. No plaque, no preservation. Wilkins, broke and humiliated, faded from public memory. His accomplishments in the Antarctic, his daring aerial photography of unexplored continents, all overshadowed by one submarine misadventure. Yet, in private circles of explorers and scientists, a quiet respect remained. They knew what it meant to gamble everything for discovery. They knew what it cost. Wilkins had stared into the Arctic's icy abyss and returned. That, alone, placed him in a league of his own. Sir Hubert Wilkins died in 1958, largely forgotten by the world he once dared to explore. He passed away not in the icy extremes, but quietly, at the age of 70. Yet even in death, his heart remained tethered to the ends of the earth. The U.S. Navy, recognizing the quiet greatness beneath his final failure, honored his last wish. In 1959, aboard the nuclear-powered USS Skate, a new generation of explorers made what Wilkins could not, a successful journey beneath the polar ice. They surfaced at the North Pole. And there, amidst the silence of a frozen, wind-blasted world, they scattered his ashes. The snowflakes carried the remains of a man who had lived for uncharted frontiers, a man who had dreamed beyond what machines and men thought possible. Wilkins never saw glory in his final mission, but his bones now rest where few have ever stood. At the top of the world. Not all explorers are remembered in parades and statues. Some are remembered only by the ice and the stars above it. In the story of human exploration, not all paths lead to triumph. Some end in bitter cold, broken machinery, and fading headlines. But every misstep still moves the needle of progress forward. Sir Hubert Wilkins didn't conquer the Arctic beneath the ice. He didn't earn the prize. He didn't get the parade. But he dared. And that matters. His story reminds us that exploration is never just about reaching a destination. It's about the attempt, the risk, the madness, the vision. It's about those who walk alone where maps run out. And sometimes, those who fall short are the very ones who make it possible for others to succeed. This was the story of a submarine, the forgotten dream, and the man who tried to take humanity where no one had gone before.